Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to another IT JD NEG webinar hosted by CompTIA. My name is Jeff LaRoe. I'm here with Nicole Maceberg, and today our big topic is IT interviewing. So as everyone here knows, a big part of the JD NEG project that DCEO has going on now is getting some kind of work-based learning role for the IT clients. And from the questionnaires that we discussed in the last webinar, it seems like most workforce locations require candidates to meet with the employer in some capacity before signing them on for a work-based learning opportunity. So the basic thought here is, IT customers need to know how to prepare for their interview and nail it. Even outside the whole JD NEG thing, your IT clients will all hopefully find themselves in an IT interview at some point in the near future. And they're going to need to know how to handle it. We only really want to focus on the IT portion of interviewing because, look, you're all workforce centers, so you guys know how to advise your clients about, their interviews, right? The problem is that this information is constantly changing. So I'm still going to touch on some of those basic interviewing skills just as a refresher. If you haven't taken a professional development class on interviewing skills in a while, there might be some trends that you're not quite aware of, so I still want to touch on those as well. As always, we have our chat box here open for anyone who has any questions. You'll have to hit the chat box button, which I think is at the top right of the screen, for that to come up. But we have the chat box open. We also encourage you guys to check out the Illinois WorkNet IT JD NEG page that has a wealth of information about getting your IT people back to work, as well as a backlog of all the webinars that we've done so far. That website is www.illinoisworknet.com/job-driven-NEG. We'll be putting this webinar in PowerPoint up there in the next few days, which will include this slide with all the links that I mentioned and all the sources that I have in the websites that I mentioned in today's webinar. So you'll be able to get access to that. We have the agenda here. I have this broken up into two different sections. So the first half of the webinar, I'm going to be talking about IT-specific interviewing tips for your customers. And the back half, I'm going to be talking about, going through some interviewing tips that everybody has to keep in mind. This webinar probably won't be too lengthy either. I'm aiming for a quick half-hour blast of interviewing tips for your clients. So hopefully I won't go over that mark too much, but, sometimes I blab a lot. All right, I've shown this picture a few other times on webinars in the past, and I really like it because it demonstrates that even something simple like this picture can have wildly different interpretations. Some people look at this picture and they see an old woman looking to the left. Other people see a young woman looking away. It's the same thing that happens with a lot of job hunting advice, right? Some people tell you to have a long resume. Some say to have a short one. Some people tell you to carry a business card at all times. Others tell you that business cards are a thing of the past, so on and so forth. A good recent example of this that I came across when I was doing research for this webinar was I saw one article talking about the importance of just wearing a white or blue shirt during an interview if you're a guy, because those are the only two safe colors, right? The very next article that I looked at talked about wearing a white or blue shirt and how it makes you look like a boring candidate, who follows the pack and follows the trends and doesn't innovate or think for themselves. So the point is that job search advice is one big gray area. I wanted to be clear about this up front, that these discrepancies exist and they exist in droves. So luckily for you guys, we won't really be going through those kind of nitpicky interviewing tips really. I'm going to try and stay on point for IT interviewing tips that are fairly conclusive and aren't in that gray area. All right, let's get started with IT-specific interviewing tips. All right, so the first tip that we have here is also the most important. You'd think that it'd be something like demonstrating your ability to do the job or something like that. But the most important interviewing tip for an IT candidate is actually just having basic soft skills. So what do I mean by basic soft skills? Things like communication skills, teamwork ability, adaptability, dependability, being able to coach someone, things like that. Talking to IT hiring managers on this subject, it actually surprised me that these soft skills would be so highly sought after in IT interviews because, I mean, in the world of IT, you don't immediately think of soft skills, right? If anything, stereotypical IT people are kind of known for having bad soft skills. If anybody remembers that, it was a Jimmy Fallon skit from SNL maybe, 10 or 15 years ago, where he was the IT guy for his company, and he was very socially inept and very abrasive. That's the kind of stereotype we're dealing with here, right? So if an IT person walks into an interview with good soft skills, they will immediately stand out to an employer. And it doesn't have to be anything spectacular either. Something as simple as communication skills can make an IT person stand out. Just being able to verbalize IT skills and experiences are more important just since so many IT people are introverted. It's particularly a problem because they usually are interviewing with an HR person first, right? And HR people usually don't know the IT acronyms and all that stuff. So being able to describe what you do clearly and concisely becomes incredibly important to an IT candidate on a job interview. Increasingly, as time goes on, the old IT trope of the IT person being a loner who never talks to anyone is not true, because IT is more integrated into the daily business activities. Maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, that trope was true, but with technology becoming more and more prevalent in the workplace, it's not really accurate anymore. There's actually there's a great article that our director here at the Creating IT Futures Foundation found about how soft skills are becoming the only things that can't be automated. So increasingly, companies want someone with soft skills who can be taught to do a task rather than hiring an industry expert who can't communicate well with coworkers, right? It was on Fortune Magazine's website. The article was called "Humans Are Underrated." I would definitely check that out if you have some free time. It was a great article. We have a link to it at the end of this PowerPoint, which you'll be able to click on once we put it on Illinois WorkNet. I was also reading an interview with an IT director from Colorado who said he doesn't put much effort into asking any normal interview questions. He only focuses on how the candidate does with interpersonal skills and soft skills like eye contact and holding a conversation, etc. The basic point to walk away here with is, if there's one tip to give your clients about their IT interview, this is the most important one. All the other tips that I'm going to go through in this webinar are secondary. If your client can get across their interpersonal skills in the interview, they're already more than a few steps ahead of their competition. So the next thing I want to talk about is very similar to the first tip about soft skills, and that is the idea that behavioral interviewing is big in IT. So there was an interview with a director of IT for US Bank who said almost all of his interviewing questions are behavioral. And I know from talking to people at Walgreens that the Walgreens IT interviews are the exact same way. So now, obviously, those are just two examples, but a lot of research that we did corroborate that idea. It's this idea that IT interviews are based more on behavioral interviewing questions than anything else. Again, kind of surprising because it's IT. You'd think it would be computer tests or something like that. But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because there are so many things to know in IT, like programming languages, operating systems, things like that. And the technology changes so quickly that a hiring manager is more likely to quiz a candidate on what he or she is capable of learning rather than what they're already experts in. So before I go any further, let me get into some definitions and examples of what behavioral interviewing is. These are questions that almost always start with some sort of variant of the phrase, "Tell me about a time when." In the IT world, a behavioral interviewing question can be something like, "Tell me about a time when you adapted to a technological change in the workplace." The hiring manager is asking the candidate to tell maybe a quick, 2 to 3 minute story to answer the question, but the candidate can get thrown off pretty easily if they're not prepared to answer a question like that beforehand. So usually these questions have to do with either a success or a problem from the past. A success would be like, tell me about a time when you went above and beyond what was called of you to complete a project or something like that, right? And a problem question would be maybe about something like not meeting deadlines or complaints that people have had about your work, or maybe vendor problems that you've had, disagreements, communication errors with a coworker, things like that. So what's the best way for your clients to answer these questions? Well, a good rule of thumb is to prepare 3 successful stories from working on projects in the past and 1 unsuccessful story. This way your client will have 3 solid examples that they can pull from to use for a variety of different questions. But they'll also have a prepared story for when an interview asks them something like, you know, tell me about a time when you didn't finish a project on time. How did you handle it? Well, it's important to prepare 1 unsuccessful story because if the candidate is only prepared to talk about their previous successes, a question about their failures in the past can really throw them off. When preparing their stories, job seekers need to keep in mind that these are meant to test how self-aware they are. So, you know, if they're asking a question like, tell me about a time when you had a difficulty with your boss, and they answer the question by talking about how terrible of a person their boss was, it's going to make them look bad. They won't look like a team player in that case. Negatively talking about past coworkers or companies in an interview it's always a bad idea, but it's especially a bad idea when answering a behavioral interviewing question, right? As a side note here, if your customer has asked a question that might require them to go negative, they should always try to put a positive spin on it by saying what they learned from the experience or how they've grown from it. Another way to attack these behavioral interviewing questions is to use what's called the STAR method. So with this, we're kind of wading into some very stereotypical workforce jargon, which I usually try to avoid because I find it too academic and not very practical. I also normally despise acronyms in these presentations, and I try to avoid them like the plague. But actually, the STAR method is a good way for a job seeker to train themselves to tell a cohesive story in about 2 to 3 minutes. So the STAR method stands for situation, task, action, and result. It's just a structure to keep in mind for job seekers as a way to cohesively tell a story. The reason this is needed is because most people are actually pretty bad at telling stories, right? They either go on for too long, or they go for too short, or they leave out certain details, or they say things like, you know, oh wait, I forgot to mention this, and then they say a vital detail that the listener needed 4 minutes ago, right? If job seekers practice answering questions by spending 20 or 30 seconds explaining the background situation, and then the task at hand, and then the action that was taken, and then the result of that action, their story will become much more to the point and cohesive. It takes practice to do this, though, so they need to get used to telling a story this way in order for their answers to flow smoothly, but it's worth that extra effort. Having said that, sometimes even the STAR method isn't enough to answer these behavioral interviewing questions. And you know, if the candidate can't grasp the answer right away, or they get stuck, or one of their prepared answers isn't quite perfect for the question that they've been asked, it's okay for them to think the answer through out loud. A lot of hiring managers, particularly ones in IT, it's very problem-solving based, right? They like to hear how the candidates approach a problem that they don't quite know the answer to yet. I'll get into more detail about that when I talk about Google-style questions later on. Along those same lines, don't stress out too much about what they call gotcha questions. So what I mean by gotcha questions are they're meant to make you slip up or meant to make you fumble or get flustered, right? Something like, what did you like least about your previous boss, or something like that, right? This kind of question is a trap made to get you to talk poorly about your previous coworkers and maybe make you divulge too much information about yourself. From a survey on Computer World, most good IT managers understand that gotcha questions aren't a good measurement in an interview environment. So like I said, I would tell your customers not to worry about those too much. If your customer feels like a question might be a trap, they just need to remember to stay positive in their answer. All right, Google questions. So the last group of IT-specific questions that I want to address are what I like to call Google questions. If you guys have heard of these, they've gained a lot of popularity over the last decade or so, mostly because places like Google are known for asking these types of questions in their interviews to their prospective candidates. Because Google popularized it, a ton of other small startups, particularly in the IT field, have followed that trend. So you get them in a lot of IT industry interviews. What they are these absurd, over-the-top, ridiculous questions that are meant to throw your customer off guard. So something like, if you were part of a cheeseburger, what part would you be and why? Or one that I've actually gotten in an interview before, which was, if you were shrunk to the size of a fly and put inside a blender, and you had 1 minute before the blender got turned on, what would you do? Now, that's a silly question, right? The purpose of these silly questions is to see how your brain processes a problem that it wasn't expecting. So, if someone runs into your office on a Friday afternoon and says something like, we don't have that huge project that we thought we were going to have, what do we do? And they're all frantic. They want to see how you're going to react to that kind of situation that comes out of nowhere that you weren't expecting. With these ridiculous questions, your client can be encouraged to think out loud. It's probably the best way to go about these absurd questions. Like I said, the point is to see your candidate's thought process. So talking through the problem is the best way to approach it. If your client just uses, short 3-word answers for these types of questions, it's not going to give the interviewer the type of insight that they're looking for. A short 3-word answer is the equivalent of bombing the question in this instance. So the candidate should talk their way through it. There's also, I have a picture here, there's also a great book out there called Are You Smart Enough to Work at Google, which I really like that book. It really goes into detail about how to answer these types of off-the-wall questions that you may not be expecting. Highly recommended if your client is going through a lot of interviews at like small startups and places like that. All right. So here are a bunch of technical sample questions that an IT person should prepare for. These are, all the ones on the screen now are from a website that I like. It's called Pluralsight, which is actually the company that owns SmarterER. If you guys remember that, it is one of the assessment tests we went through on an earlier webinar. Anyway, we're obviously not going to go through all of them right now, but we will post these and a bunch more on the JD-NEG Illinois WorkNet page. And it'd be a good idea to send your clients to that page if they have an IT interview coming up so they can brush up on those IT-specific interviewing questions. They can prepare answers to these questions and then have a friend or family member, help them practice for an interview. There are a ton of other websites that can be used for searching IT questions as well. One that I like is about.com. That has a pretty exhaustive list of IT interviewing questions as well. Again, we have these links at the back end of our PowerPoint presentation. So once we get this up on Illinois WorkNet, you can get links to the Pluralsight website and to the about.com list of IT interviewing questions. All right. Outside of soft skills and the groups of IT-specific questions that we just talked about, the only other quick tips that I wanted to be sure to mention that are specific to IT are these 4. So number 1, play to your strengths, know your stuff. If your client feels very comfortable with certain aspects of IT, they should play those up in their interview and be able to verbalize them and verbalize their technical skills. I know that sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people forget to mention this kind of thing during their interview. A lot of employers value someone with multiple strengths in IT, so they have to make sure that they address these strengths in the interview clearly. Any skills that your client has that are cross-platform should really be highlighted in their interview. Number 2, be honest about your IT knowledge. A lot of IT interviews can very easily turn into an IT test, and you don't want your client to be caught spinning a lie during their interview. Or maybe they're not lying. Maybe they're just bending the truth about how much they know about, I don't know, Windows 10 or something like that, installations, right? If they say that they know a specific programming language, they better actually know it, because the interview will turn south very quickly if they can't answer some simple questions about what they're supposed to be an expert in. Number 3, don't be afraid to be an IT nerd. I know that sounds silly, but I mean it seriously. Companies love enthusiasm, right? But even more than that, IT hiring managers love enthusiasm. So IT has a lot of things in common with hobbies like cars, right? And the people who share that IT passion tend to get along really well. So showing enthusiasm for the field of IT goes a lot further than you might think. I mean, it's like the term computer geek doesn't exist for no reason, right? In the 80s, a computer geek was a derogatory term, but now it's like the wealthiest and smartest people in the world are the ones who are enthusiastic about IT. So your client will want to let that enthusiasm show during their interview. And number 4, being ready to demonstrate abilities. So if they put your client in front of a machine to do something that they have on their resume, they better be able to do it in person. This is pretty similar to being honest about your IT knowledge. They kind of go hand in hand. So from here on out, I'm going to be talking about interviewing tips that will certainly help your IT customers, but will also help any other customers that you have as well. So let's talk about some interviewing basics. These are things that most of us think are common sense, but people make these mistakes all the time in their interview, so I need to mention them. I'm going to rocket through them pretty quickly, but they're more important than people give them credit for. So these are things like eye contact, proper handshakes, dressing professionally, smiling at everybody, being nice to the receptionist on the way in, having prepared questions to ask about the position, about training periods, about company culture, current projects, etc. These questions are really just to show an interest in the role. You also want to be on time, having a notepad for taking notes, bringing copies of the resume, turning off the cell phone, etc. I was reading a survey of IT hiring managers, and one of the results was that about 10% of the time, candidates make one or more of these mistakes during the interview. Now, 10% seems kind of small, but really, that number should be 0%, because these are all really simple things. So I think it's important to remind your clients of these small things before they go on an interview, something that they might not even think of, like smiling and talking to a receptionist. Just remind them of those small things, and they'll be better off when they go into the interview. I actually know a guy who got turned down for a role because of his handshake, if you can believe that. He gave the hiring manager what I call a dead fish handshake, so where it's limp and it's a cold hand and it's not very firm. And it was for a sales position, so the hiring manager figured a weak handshake is probably not a good idea for a salesperson, so she went with somebody else. Obviously, it's kind of an extreme example, but the point is, even something small like a bad handshake can ruin your client's chances. All right, research the company. Researching the company is a huge aspect of the interview. A lot of interviews go south because the candidate simply just didn't read anything about the company before walking in the door. If your client uses a recruiter, they'll want to ask the recruiter about the company and the hiring manager to see if they can get any extra info before the interview. If they're not using a recruiter, there might be someone in their network that they can ask about the company or the hiring manager just to get some extra information. They should also definitely use LinkedIn. Search LinkedIn. If you missed our webinar about LinkedIn, it's up on the JD&EG Illinois WorkNet page now, so you can check that out there. Using LinkedIn really should be the first thing to use in researching a company. There's a wealth of information on there just kind of waiting to be explored. Try to know the company culture as much as possible before you walk in the door. I mean, if it's a place where everybody only wears jeans and T-shirts, you might be overdressed if you walk in there with a suit and tie, right? I would also set up Google alerts if it's a bigger company like IBM or Walgreens or something like that. What these are, they're just simple alerts you can set up on your Google account that send you emails anytime that company is in the news. So let's say you have an interview at AT&T in the next couple of weeks. You set up a Google alert for AT&T, and Google's going to automatically send you an email anytime AT&T is in the news over the next couple of weeks. It's an easy way to arm yourself before an interview and just get some additional information about the company. Sometimes I tell my clients not to go too overboard or get too creepy in stalking the hiring manager on their social media pages, right? You know, if you walk into the interview and you tell them they have a cute dog or something like that, it might not sit that well with them, right? But the flip side of that is that if you attended the same college, which you can see on LinkedIn, you might be able to use that to make a more personal connection with the interviewer, and that always helps. A lot of people get into trouble during interviews because they don't gauge the hiring manager's personality all that well. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So let's say your client just went to Hawaii or something. They get back from their trip. They go on their interview. The interviewer asks, "How are you?" And the candidate launches into a story about their vacation. Now, if the interviewer is chatty and personable, this is probably not that bad of an idea. But if the interviewer is one of those kind of no-nonsense people that just wants to talk business, then launching into this vacation story just sealed their fate of not getting that job, right? So your client needs to gauge the situation and gauge the interviewer first before launching into a personal story like that. Here are some non-IT based interview questions to study up on. There are a bazillion websites dedicated to common interview questions like this. My favorites are Illinois WorkNet, obviously, and also a site called www.best-job-interview.com. We'll also have a link to that at the end of this PowerPoint up on the Illinois WorkNet website when we put it up there. So the questions in this category are things like, tell me about yourself. What's your greatest strength? What's your greatest weakness? Why do you want to work here? Why did you leave your last employer? And so on. These types of questions are pretty standard. They're all pretty frustrating for a candidate to answer. But your client really should have a good handle on how to answer these types of questions because they're very common. Again, we're not going to go through all these since you guys are workforce locations. You probably heard answers to them 1,000 times. But if you'd like to know our thoughts on how to answer these types of questions, you can always reach out to us. We'd be happy to discuss them with you. Another common question I got from job seekers was about how to respond to layoff questions. The best response to a layoff questions, or the best responses to layoff questions are short and sweet. Something like, the company was cutting back, and unfortunately my job was one that was eliminated, and that's it. Don't say anything more than that. The reason why you don't want to say more than that is because layoffs usually come with some kind of emotional baggage, right? And the more your client talks about their layoff, the more that baggage is going to show through. And the worst thing that you can do in an interview is speak negatively about past experiences because it just makes you look like a negative person to work with. So being quick, being flat, and being to the point about a layoff is the best way to go about it. The company was cutting back, and unfortunately my job wasn't eliminated. That's all you need to say. A lot of my previous clients would also ask me about how to handle illegal interviewing questions during an interview. So this is a touchy subject, obviously, because a lot of job seekers, they don't necessarily want to answer questions about their age or anything like that. It's very understandable. There are a lot of other common questions besides age that are actually illegal to ask too, but employers do it anyway. Usually it's because they don't know that they're illegal. Things like, do you have any kids, or what country are you from originally, or are you married? Seem like conversation starters to a lot of hiring managers. They don't realize that they're actually illegal to ask. So what should a job seeker do in this situation? Answering might cost them the job if the answer isn't what the interviewer is looking for, but not answering might make them seem like they're difficult to work with. What's the best thing to do? Well, firstly, your client needs to judge the intent of the question, right? And if an interviewer is just trying to make conversation and asks about kids or something like that, well, that's not really that big of a deal, right? But if the interviewer is being cagey and they're asking things like, what year did you graduate high school or something like that, that's an indication that the interviewer is trying to figure out how old the candidate is, and that's no good. If the interviewer is getting a little too inquisitive about things that make the candidate uncomfortable, a good line for them to practice is, that's a good question. I'd be happy to answer it if it relates to the position. Now, obviously, tone is important when you're saying that sentence, right? Because if they use that line with sarcasm or with disrespect, that's not going to help at all. So they might need to say it aloud a few times on their own just to practice that tone. They wouldn't want to say it like, yeah, that's a good question, but that doesn't even relate to what we're talking about here, right? If they say it that way, that would surely be bad news. But if they ask a question in sort of a non-confrontational way, and if the question does relate to the position, then that's a great chance for the candidate to squash any hesitation that the company might have about bringing them on. So let me give you an example. Interviewer asks how old the candidate is. Candidate says, great question, happy to answer if it relates to the position. The interviewer goes, well, actually, yeah, your boss would be about half your age, and that's a concern that we have. The candidate can come back from that easily by saying something like, well, actually, my last boss was significantly younger than me, and it really wasn't a big deal at all. As long as I had confidence in him or her to manage and do his job correctly, there's really no reason for any concern. They answer it that way, and your client is addressing any reservations that the hiring manager might have about them and their age, and they're addressing it head on, and kind of leaving them with a positive outlook rather than this hesitation about age. And if it's truly an offensive question, the job seeker is well within their rights to notify EEOC. They just have to know that if they do that, they're definitely not going to get that job, right? Honestly, though, if the hiring manager is asking awful questions, why would they want to work for them anyway, right? Okay, so there are a couple questions that the job candidate absolutely has to ask at the end of the interview. And those include, what are the next steps in the interviewing process? When can I expect a decision to be made? When would be the best time to follow up with you? Things like that. You want to ask these questions just so you're not waiting in an agonizing limbo 2 weeks later waiting for the call back, right? They might say something like, we're expecting to make a decision tomorrow. Well, if tomorrow comes and goes and your client doesn't hear back, they can call back to check. If the company decided to go with somebody else, they can move on to the next job opportunity instead of waiting by the phone day and night, wondering when they're going to get a call, right? And that's an agonizing place to be in. These questions are also good to fill that, there's that awkward time when the interview is over, but you haven't walked out the door yet. That moment it's always been awkward on every interview I've ever been on, right? So when you're shuffling your papers after the conversation is over and you're getting ready to leave, you can ask these questions instead of sort of stewing in a weird silence. Job seekers should always end a good interview by reinforcing that they want the role and asking these questions. And then there's the notion of following up after the interview is over. So I have to tell you guys a quick story. So I was in an interview once. It went really well. I felt good about it. Seemed like the hiring manager felt pretty good about it. The CEO was in on the interview as well. He seemed to feel good about it. So I was feeling pretty optimistic. About a week later, I get an email from the CEO that said this. It said, Jeff, I really liked talking to you last week. I thought we had a great conversation, which is why I was surprised to not get a thank you email from you or a follow-up email from you. This would have showed an unquestioning interest in the position, but since that never came, we decided to go with somebody else. Yikes, right? You can imagine my horrified reaction when I got this. So any interview I've been on since then, I've been sure to send some kind of follow-up email just thanking the person for their time and reiterating my interest in the role. Again, this is an extreme example. Not every hiring manager is going to be this nitpicky about thank you emails and follow-up emails, but most of them like to have that follow-up because it shows that you have an interest in the role. Point is, following up is something that your clients should be sure to do. Make sure that they do it. I am going to throw this over to Nicole so she can wrap everything up. Give me 1 second.
Do you want to put your PowerPoint back up? All right, guys, sorry about this little cold. We just wanted to thank you all for attending the webinar today. These interviewing tips, trying to keep everything online with the IT goals of getting your job seekers employed in the IT field. So in part of that, we want to present another JD-NEG Open Forum webinar. We had one of these a little while ago. I think it worked pretty well. The goal of this Open Forum webinar, which is going to be on September 24th at 2 p.m., is to give you guys a chance to call in, offer up any questions or troubled areas that you guys have been having so that we can all really learn from each other. Jeff and I have been going out. We've been doing site visits. We plan to reach out and meet with everybody. We're learning a lot of really good things from you guys. So we want to be sure that all this information is being shared with the group so that we can all use this JD-NEG grant to enhance our IT job seekers opportunities out there and really learn from each other. So again, that next upcoming webinar is going to be on September 24th at 2 p.m. It will be one where you can call in. We'll do a webinar as well, but you'll be able to actually speak on the webinar with everybody and get answers either directly from us or from other partners that we're working with. And so we invite you to join that. That invitation will be coming out very shortly, probably within the next day or two. If you want to go ahead and switch. So we just, again, want to say thank you. Any questions or any trouble areas that you guys are having, please be sure to contact us. Again, we're learning so much from you guys, some great things with Burning Glass, some great things with employer outreach. We should have more materials for the 4 Ps that we mentioned in the last webinar up on the JD-NEG website here soon on Illinois WorkNet. And so we welcome you to go ahead and take a look at those. And if you have any questions, please direct them our way. We're going to go ahead and sign off for today, but we will stay on this webinar for a little bit of time. Remember, you can raise your hand or you can mention anything in the chat box and we'll try to answer you directly. You're more than welcome to call us at any time too. We look forward to hearing from all of you. So thank you again for joining us today.